There is a silent moment each morning before the world rushes back into existence. A space between dreaming and waking where you briefly exist without a story. No title, no memory, no anxiety about what must be done or who you must be. And then, without asking permission, the voice returns. A sentence appears in your mind already complete. Something to worry about, something to plan, something to regret. You didn't choose it. You didn't construct it word by word. It simply arrived, dressed in your voice, carrying the authority of self. And before you realize what has happened, the day has begun again inside a narrative you never consciously authored. Thought feels intimate because it echoes in the tone of me, yet intimacy should never be confused with origin. Neuroscience now confirms what contemplatives sensed for millennia. Conscious awareness does not generate thought, it receives it. Brain imaging shows that neural activity initiates thought hundreds of milliseconds before you become aware of thinking. The mind speaks first, you listen second. Even the simplest mental phrase emerges already formed, delivered into your awareness as though drawn from an invisible stream of cognition moving beneath conscious will. Which leaves a disturbing question suspended in the inner silence. If you did not initiate your thoughts, who did? We inherit the assumption that the brain produces consciousness, yet escalating evidence suggests the reverse may be true. Consciousness receives patterns through the brain the way a radio receives sound through encoded frequencies. David Bohm described reality as a holographic field of information where consciousness extracts experience through resonance. Nassim Haramein extends this into quantum vacuum theory, proposing that the zero-point field stores all informational states awaiting detection. Tesla famously warned that the secrets of the universe are not mechanical but vibrational: frequency, resonance, coherence. And somewhere between physics and philosophy, a revelation emerges. Your thoughts may be less like inventions and more like broadcasts. Observe them for a moment. You do not select each idea as it forms. They cascade spontaneously. Worries, comparisons, plans, memories, many arising contrary to your conscious wishes. Attempt to silence thinking and watch what happens. The voice continues. Not because you choose it, but because your nervous system is tuned to ongoing transmissions encoded by past conditioning, emotional survival circuits, social saturation, and biological entrainment loops. Modern civilization unknowingly perfected this tuning process. Media feeds, advertising cycles, reward algorithms, cultural fear narratives all function as frequency conditioners, attuning consciousness to scarcity rhythms, comparison spectral bands, identity polarization loops. Most minds now operate as receivers locked into narrow bandwidths of anxiety and self-referential belief, unaware there are other frequencies available. Yet beneath the mental static exists a deeper signal, subtle, non-verbal, profoundly coherent. Ancient mystics called it the Logos. Jung named it the Self. The Taoists knew it as the Way. Penrose and Hameroff theorize coherent structures that transmit quantum information beyond classical thinking, aligning cognition with an intelligent field of emergence beyond words. The 1% who quietly shape events do not dominate reality with thought, they disengage from it. They learned that thought is not power, tuning is power, and the moment you realize your thoughts may not belong to you, something extraordinary happens. The illusion of mental authorship dissolves, and consciousness begins to remember itself as the chooser of frequency, rather than the servant of narrative. Core, premise, the transmission mechanism of mind. Once you begin to loosen your grip on the assumption that thoughts originate from you, a more unsettling understanding emerges. Thought does not behave like a tool wielded by consciousness. It behaves like a current moving through consciousness. Awareness does not manufacture each internal sentence like a novelist drafting prose. It receives mental data streams already encoded with emotional tone, narrative structure, and implicit meaning. Consciousness becomes the listening chamber, the silent theatre in which thought performs its uninvited monologue. This explains something you have sensed but never been taught to question, why your mind continues speaking even when you attempt silence, why a worry arises when you wish for peace, why destructive beliefs persist long after logic has discredited them. You can command thought, yet it does not obey, because command belongs to authorship, and thought obeys transmission. Modern neuroscience confirms this paradox. Preconscious neural activity ignites before awareness registers the idea, demonstrating that conscious will does not generate thinking, it witnesses its emergence. But what activates that neural pattern in the first place? To answer this, researchers studying electromagnetic brain coherence at institutions such as HeartMath have mapped the human nervous system not merely as a chemical processor, but as a biological antenna, responsive to emotional frequencies, informational resonance fields, and environmental coherence patterns. The mind becomes less a generator and more a tuner. Each emotional state adjusts the dial. Fear narrows reception into survival frequencies where thoughts emerge as anxiety, competition, or deficiency narratives. Desire tunes into endless seeking loops, never arriving, eternally wanting. Grief thickens the signal with memory feedback that collapses the future into repetition of the past. Your felt emotional temperature quietly calibrates which mental transmissions the brain receives. The majority of humanity never escapes the survival spectrum. Its frequencies are dense, noisy, and compulsive, tuned to scarcity, vigilance, social comparison, and external validation. And because thought patterns on these frequencies reinforce identity with lack and limitation, individuals unknowingly collapse probabilities consistent with this cognitive worldview, selecting experiences of struggle and repetition not because they desire them, but because they are tuned to perceive only that bandwidth of reality. The 1% discovered what ancient initiates protected in silence. You cannot think your way into mastery. You must tune your way into perception. They do not battle intrusive thoughts. They don't attempt positivity campaigns or affirmation rituals. Instead, they awaken beneath thought, disengaging identity from the narratives received, and cultivate coherent states that retune the nervous system into a wider spectrum of awareness. In this widened spectrum, another mode of perception emerges, not structured like verbal thinking, but as direct knowing. It arrives without arguments or internal chatter. It does not attempt to persuade, it simply informs. Action chosen from this still clarity carries an unmistakable quality, effortlessness. And when action flows from coherence instead of mental noise, reality reorganizes accordingly, not because thoughts willed circumstances into existence, but because observation has shifted into a frequency where new probabilities become visible. The unseen truth is simple and seismic. You're not trapped inside thought. Thought is passing through you. And the moment you stop confusing incoming transmissions with inner truth, consciousness awakens from narrative captivity into creative command. Scientific bridge, the quantum receiver of consciousness. The scientific scaffolding beneath this revelation is both elegant and unsettling. For decades, neuroscience framed the brain as a closed biochemical machine. Neurons firing in isolated loops generating the entirety of mind. But as imaging refined and interdisciplinary research expanded, that model began to fracture. What emerged instead was a far more intricate portrait. The brain behaves less like a factory of thought and more like a transducer, converting ambient information into conscious experience. Quantum biologist Stuart Hameroff and physicist Roger Penrose proposed that microtubules within neurons operate at quantum scales, allowing information processing that transcends classical computation. Their research suggests consciousness is not produced by neural chemistry alone, but arises from quantum coherent states interacting with a background informational field. In this view, the brain becomes a biological interface, stabilizing raw quantum data into subjective awareness. Max Planck, the founder of quantum physics, foresaw this paradigm shift. Consciousness is fundamental. I regard matter as derivative from consciousness. David Bohm further dismantled the materialist worldview with his theory of the implicate order, proposing that all observed reality unfolds from a deeper, non-local holographic field of information where everything remains internally connected prior to manifestation. Your nervous system is embedded within this field. Electromagnetic measurements show that the human heart emits a field thousands of times stronger than the brain's, detectable several meters beyond the body, while EEG and MEG data demonstrate that brainwave coherence patterns shift dramatically based on emotional state alone. When fear or anxiety dominates, the nervous system becomes chaotic. Brain signals fragment, narrowing sensory and cognitive bandwidth. Under coherent states, generated through calm focus, gratitude, or emotional alignment, neural structures synchronize, increasing perceptual sensitivity and integrative intelligence. Thought reception tracks this synchronization. Chaotic nervous systems receive chaotic mental transmissions. Coherent systems receive coherent knowing. But here lies the deeper implication. The electromagnetic fields surrounding your body interact continually with the zero-point quantum field, the infinite sea of probabilities underlying space-time itself. Your emotional and neurological coherence determines how your field resonates with this quantum potential. Resonance becomes filtration, not creating new realities, but selecting which probabilities stabilize into experiential timelines. This is observation as frequency selection. The ancient Hermetic axiom "as above, so below" finally gained scientific footing. Your internal coherence mirrors the coherence potential you can perceive externally. When your nervous system vibrates in survival frequency, dominated by fear loops, overthinking, and emotional contraction, probability filters compress toward experiences of resistance and limitation. Shift your coherence, and suddenly different pathways emerge. Yet these pathways are invisible under emotional noise. They don't announce themselves with mental chatter. They appear as sudden clarity, intuitive movement, or spontaneous synchronicity, simply because the receiver has become tuned to detect them. The 1% didn't master manifestation techniques. They mastered coherence cultivation. They discovered that the equation is not thought creates reality. It is far subtler. Coherence reveals reality. And reality follows perception, not as punishment or reward, but as quantum resonance faithfully responding to the tuning of your conscious field. Ancient parallels, the ghost signal in mystical traditions. Long before oscilloscopes measured electromagnetic coherence, or physicists theorized quantum fields, ancient traditions were mapping the same terrain, using the only instruments they possessed: contemplative awareness and symbolic insight. What they discovered through inner observation mirrors precisely what modern science has begun to validate: that the ordinary thinking mind is not the origin of perception, but a surface current riding atop a far deeper ocean of intelligence. The Upanishads described thought as vrittis, mental ripples stirred upon the lake of consciousness, distortions, not creators, of perception. Liberation did not arrive through refining thought, but by dissolving identification with the thinker itself. When the mind stills, they taught, the seer abides in its own nature. This was not metaphor, it was instruction in frequency disengagement, stepping out of transmitted cognition into coherent presence. Hermetic philosophy echoed this knowing. The human being was named a microcosm, a receiver nested within the greater cosmic mind. Paracelsus wrote that wisdom does not originate in cerebral reason, but descends through resonant attunement with the anima mundi, the world soul broadcasting informational intelligence across existence. Thought, he cautioned, was a veil, not a gateway, unless loosened from egoic identification. Taoist sages taught the discipline of Wu Wei, effortless action that flows naturally from harmony rather than command. They observed that forced intention produced turbulence, while surrendered coherence allowed the Tao to operate through the human instrument. The Tao Te Ching never urged positive thinking or manipulation of desire, only resonance. Be still as water, and the way reveals itself. In Gnostic writings, the distinction between nous, direct divine knowing, and dianoia, discursive reasoning, was sacred. Salvation was not achieved by accumulating belief, but through gnosis, a form of non-verbal knowing arising when mental chatter collapsed into inner silence. They taught that humanity's true captivity was not sin, but mental occupation, captivity by false narratives that fractured perception. Even Rumi echoed this truth poetically. Try not to learn with your mind, learn to see with your heart. He was not romanticizing emotion, he was referencing coherence, the alignment of consciousness beyond the linguistic mind where intuitive perception resolves without words. Jung later reframed this ancient wisdom psychologically. The ego, identified with internal linguistic thought, believed itself to be the thinker. Yet beneath ego cognition lay the self, an autonomous intelligence communicating not in sentences, but through images, instincts, dreams, and synchronicities, a symbolic informational stream guiding individuation beyond conscious reasoning. Across cultures, the same realization arose. Thought does not reveal truth, it obscures it unless received without attachment. The ancient masters were not silencing the mind for peace alone. They were disengaging from mental frequencies that prevented perception of deeper orders of information. They were tuning their awareness to the ghost signal beneath thinking, a living intelligence that modern science now recognizes as quantum informational coherence, and life began to flow differently around those who could hear it. Not because they commanded reality, but because they listened to the louder silence beneath all words. Human reflection. The story you never chose. If the science feels distant and the mysticism too elevated to touch daily life, return to the most human place of all, your own lived experience. Look honestly at the narrative that runs through your mind every day. The judgments, the doubts, the rehearsed conversations, the quiet comparisons, the subtle undertone of not enough. Did you consciously choose those stories, or did you inherit them the same way you inherited language, unconsciously by immersion? Most people believe their personality is a product of choice, yet the deeper truth is more sobering. Personality emerges from repeated exposure to transmitted thought patterns before conscious discernment even develops. Childhood environments seed emotional frequencies, safety or fear, abundance or precarity, which tune the nervous system toward particular mental bandwidths. Cultural narratives reinforce these spectra: success anxiety, social hierarchy, body valuation, performance identity, broadcasting psychic conditioning long before self-awareness awakens. And so, identity forms not as an act of freedom, but of absorption. The inner critic rarely speaks in a voice you consciously selected. It arises with inherited cadence. The urge to compare yourself against others flows seamlessly from social transmission loops optimized for external valuation. The assumption that suffering is normal became an unquestioned premise simply because it was encoded into your emotional education. Even ambition often masquerades as desire when in reality it expresses communal pressure frequencies, not authentic inner guidance. And yet, every human has experienced moments when thought receded, and something else surfaced. You felt it in sudden clarity during grief, when words fell away and presence surged. In intense creative flow, when action unfolded without conscious narration. In moments of deep love, awe, or forgiveness, when silence replaced storytelling and certainty emerged without argument. Those moments were not emotional accidents. They were brief returns to coherence, where identity disengaged from transmitted cognition and reconnected with direct knowing. The tragedy is not that people lack power, it is that they misattribute power to thinking instead of tuning. Most lives are shaped chasing story revision rather than narrative liberation, trying to think better thoughts rather than stepping below thought into the field where perception reorganizes. And so humanity cycles endlessly. Motivational efforts replacing coherence training, affirmation replacing awareness, informational consumption replacing frequency discipline. We try desperately to rewrite mental scripts, unaware the script itself was never the author. When disappointment returns, we blame ourselves, not realizing the receiver was tuned to limitation before thought ever spoke. But awakening does not require heroic struggle. It requires recognition. The moment you realize your thoughts are not the sovereign voice of your being, but passing transmissions shaped by resonance conditioning, identity loosens. You stop defending negative stories. You stop chasing positive ones. You step into a quiet neutrality, observing rather than obeying, and something softens inside. This shift is the true threshold of liberation. You're no longer captive to the stories you never chose, and in that space beyond mental authorship, you discover that your deepest self was never speaking in sentences at all. It was whispering through silence. Emotional frequency, the tuning fork of reality. Emotion is not decorative to consciousness, it is instrumental. Long before thought constructs narrative, feeling calibrates perception. Emotion is the tuning fork that determines which frequency band your nervous system locks into, and from that tuning, which thoughts, experiences, and future pathways become accessible to awareness. Thought merely annotates the emotional signal already in motion. HeartMath Institute's research revealed what mystics intuited. Emotional coherence reorganizes the central nervous system. Under emotional stress, fear, shame, anger, or anxiety, heart rhythms become erratic, chaotic, incoherent. EEG patterns fragment. Cognitive function narrows. Perception compresses around threat processing loops. In this state, thoughts become defensive, comparative, hurried. Survival narratives optimized for protection rather than creation. But when emotional coherence arises, through calm presence, gratitude, compassion, or genuine appreciation, heart and brain rhythms synchronize, neural circuits widen, cognitive flexibility expands, the nervous system shifts from survival vigilance into receptive discernment, thought quiets, and knowing emerges. This coherent shift is not positive thinking. It is physiological phase alignment, the nervous system settling into harmonic resonance that retunes perception into a broader spectrum of informational possibility. Emotion is therefore not simply personal sentiment, it is a quantum interface. It sculpts the electromagnetic field the body emits, and that field selects which informational expressions of the quantum landscape collapse into experiential reality. This is not mysticism, it is field interaction physics expressed through biology. A contracted emotional state broadcasts chaotic resonance, filtering perception towards struggle probabilities, missed opportunities, miscommunication, repetition of unfavourable loops. An expansive emotional state broadcasts coherence, filtering perception toward alignment pathways, synchronistic timing, effortless movement, seemingly lucky interventions that are nothing more than resonant optics. This truth reframes emotional mastery entirely. You do not manage feelings merely to feel better. You regulate emotion because it governs reality interaction. Most humans unknowingly live emotionally dysregulated, oscillating between stress stimulation, consumption dopamine loops, worry cycles, comparative insecurity, and desire addiction. Those loops entrench the nervous system in incoherent frequency patterns that continually lock perception into the same world narrative. Constant effort, insufficient progress, endless struggle with circumstance. The 1% cultivate the opposite. They do not suppress emotions, nor do they indulge volatility. They stabilize coherence deliberately. In moments of pressure, they regulate physiology, slowing breath, softening tension, restoring rhythmic equilibrium, before engaging decision or action. Only then do they allow thought to arise from coherence rather than contraction. From this ordering, emotion first, perception second, thought third, action emerges aligned rather than reactive. From coherence, solutions feel inevitable rather than engineered, not forced, discovered. And this is why those tuned into emotional coherence seem guided by invisible currents of opportunity. They appear lucky, but luck is merely coherent perception, detecting probabilities invisible to dysregulated receivers. Emotion is not weakness. It is the most powerful tuning technology humanity possesses. Master emotion, and you master access to reality's deeper branches, not by control, but by coherence. The sevenfold gateway of inner transmission. Within consciousness exists a layered architecture, a sevenfold descent of experience through which information travels before becoming thought. This pattern is not myth. It mirrors both mystical cosmology and neurological processing models, revealing how the signal of reality transforms into the story of mind. To awaken is not to transcend these layers, but to navigate them consciously. At the first gateway, raw awareness resides, the silent witness before perception. This field has no language, no narrative, no emotional charge. It is presence unfractured. Every human has briefly inhabited this state in moments of awe, deep meditation, or shock, when mental commentary halts and perception becomes strangely luminous. The second gateway manifests as emotional tone. Here, awareness meets physiological resonance. The heart rhythm imprints coherence or chaos onto consciousness, defining the bandwidth upon which perception operates. Emotional frequency becomes the tuning grid, shaping the entire reception spectrum ahead. The third gateway is imagery, symbolic cognition. Before words form, the psyche receives information as images, archetypes, instincts, intuitions, or sudden gestalts of understanding. Jung called this the symbolic mind, the intermediary where deeper knowing morphs into perceivable meaning. The fourth gateway produces language, internal speech, where symbols become sentences and narratives. This is not the origin of insight, it is its translation. Yet humanity confuses this bridge as source, believing thought itself births understanding. The fifth gateway is identity encoding, where repeated narratives crystallize into personality constructs. Self-image, belief systems, emotional habits, all emerge from narratives repeated until they become the illusion of selfhood. Here the ego solidifies, and perception becomes selective. The sixth gateway becomes behavioral enactment, the outward performance dictated by perceived identity, shaping choices, patterns, habits, and social interactions, all flowing from identity constructs that were never consciously chosen. The final gateway becomes reality confirmation, the environmental feedback loop where experiences reflect the frequencies broadcast internally, validating belief structures through apparent evidence, reinforcing the origin story, completing the cycle of entrainment. The human tragedy is this: most people mistake gateway 4, thought, as both origin and authority, never realizing they live downstream from much deeper processes. The mastery taught by mystics, and now echoed by quantum neuroscience, is ascent through the gateways, gently retreating backward from behavior into belief, belief into story, story into symbol, symbol into emotion, emotion into stillness, ultimately arriving again at awareness prior to all conditioning. In that source state, perception expands, identity softens, thought loses tyranny. Here, reception shifts. When consciousness reoccupies the first gateway, presence pure, something extraordinary occurs. Emotional coherence naturally stabilizes, symbolic insight sharpens, thought quiets into clarity, and perception reorganizes around intuitive flow. This is the state from which the 1% operate, not because of genetics or privilege, but because they learn to inhabit upstream awareness instead of downstream mental noise. They do not attempt to correct life circumstances directly, they correct the point of reception. From that altitude, reality does not need to be controlled. It unfolds naturally in alignment with the deeper signal of the self, not the passing transmissions of narrative mind. This is not transcendence by escape, but ascendance by return, a journey back to the stillness that always knew the way forward. Collapse of separation, the illusion of divided reality. At the deepest level of awakening, a single realization dissolves the final veil. There has never been a true boundary between you and the field you observe. The sensation of separation, self here, world there, is not an ultimate truth. It emerges from perception filtered through identity, story, and emotional contraction. When consciousness ascends back upstream, beyond narrative thought and rests again in coherent presence, the architecture shifts, and the observer recognizes itself as part of the observed. Modern physics quietly echoes this ancient revelation. Quantum entanglement demonstrates that particles separated by vast distances behave as unified systems, responding instantaneously regardless of spatial division. David Bohm interpreted this not as anomaly, but as evidence of a deeper implicate order, a holographic wholeness in which local separations are perceptual illusions manufactured by unfolded perception. The universe does not consist of independent parts interacting. It is a single field expressing temporarily localized patterns of awareness. When consciousness disengages from the fragmentation imposed by mental labeling, perception naturally widens. The subtle tension of me versus reality erodes. Action no longer feels like resistance against circumstance, but like participation within unfolding harmonics. This collapse of separation explains the enigmatic precision behind spiritual states historically labelled oneness, union, or samadhi. These were never fantasies of mystical unity. They were neurological coherence experiences, moments when emotional resonance synchronizes brain hemispheres, quieting segmentation circuits and allowing holistic perception to dominate consciousness. In such states, decisions emerge with uncanny ease, not through computation, but recognition. One does not choose between options. The appropriate path arrives already selected. Synchronicities begin to cluster precisely because perception has expanded into bandwidths unseen during fragmentation. It begins to see connections that always existed, but were previously filtered by narrative blindness. No new reality was created. Only a wider reality became visible. This is the paradox that rewrites manifestation theory. Awakening is not the construction of desired futures. It is the recognition of already existing probabilistic harmonics that were hidden from limited frequency reception. The 1% operate from this collapsed separation daily. Their power is not domination, it is alignment. Their decisions appear bold yet effortless, because resistance was never injected into perception in the first place. They discover that the universe is not something to conquer, but something to cooperate with. When identity separates, striving begins. When unity returns, flow governs movement. This does not dissolve individuality, or it purifies it. You do not disappear into cosmic abstraction. You emerge as an instrument of resonance rather than a struggling personality fragment. Self becomes localized coherence, not conflicted narrative. World becomes interactive consciousness, not hostile objecthood. And in this reunion of inner and outer perception, one truth stands unmistakably clear. Reality did not need to be bent. It was always waiting to be recognized. Awakening is not escape from form. It is reunion with source within form. And in this union, the universe finally stops whispering through thought and begins speaking through experience itself. Integration, living as a tuned instrument. The true challenge of awakening is not reaching expanded states, it is living from them while remaining fully human. Enlightenment that cannot operate inside daily life becomes spiritual theatre. Integration is the art of lowering cosmic awareness down into ordinary moments, into work, conversation, choice, uncertainty, without losing coherence. When separation collapses and unity is felt, the mind can become tempted toward transcendental escape, believing that peace lies beyond the world rather than within participation. Yet the ultimate mastery is not withdrawal into stillness, it is embodiment of stillness while moving within complexity. The 1% do not retreat into silence caves. They operate amid noise without allowing the noise inside. They do not abandon ambition, they release compulsive striving. They work, but not from tension. They decide, but not from fear. They pursue vision, but without identity attachment to outcome. This is integration, allowing action to flow from coherence without being hijacked by survival frequency loops. Psychologically, integration means identity becomes flexible. You recognize that the voice narrating your day is not sovereign. It is merely a translator layered above deeper knowing. Thought resumes its proper place, as assistant, not commander. When it oversteps into anxiety narration or over-analysis spirals, awareness recenters beneath it. Emotion becomes an instrument rather than a storm. You sense contraction early, tension in breath, quickened heart rhythm, and recalibrate physically into coherence before thought crystallizes distortion. Decision-making simplifies. Instead of analytical overwhelm, clarity surfaces as a subtle inevitability, the next action feeling obvious not because it was reasoned, but because it resonated. Life synchronicities feel less extraordinary, it's more expected, because perception is continuously aligned with deeper signal flow. Even difficulty transforms, challenges arise, but they lose existential weight. They are no longer judged as threats to identity, just movements within a larger harmonic. The integrated human no longer seeks to manipulate reality through thought or effort. They tune reality engagement through coherent stability, trusting that interaction emerges naturally when presence operates upstream from fear. This does not remove emotion. Pain arises, disappointment arises, but these emotions pass without capturing identity. They return coherence more quickly, becoming waves rather than storms. Integration means that spiritual insight becomes invisible. People around you don't see mysticism. They see ease. They see grounded confidence. They see responsive intelligence. They see someone who appears supported by life itself rather than struggling against it. And that support is not supernatural. It is simply resonance recognition. To live aligned does not require renunciation, only remembrance. You still play your roles: partner, creator, leader, student, but without believing they define or confine you. You navigate the world from the frequency of self rather than the scripts of mind. And slowly, organically, a humble miracle occurs. Life stops feeling like a problem to solve and becomes a field to dance with. The remembrance of the signal. There comes a moment, subtle yet irreversible, when the seeker realizes there was never anything to become, no state to earn, no enlightenment to capture, no cosmic permission to receive. The journey that seemed so long collapses into a single recognition. You were always the listening presence beneath thought, never the voice that claimed authority over it. What you called your mind was only a receiver playing inherited frequencies. What you called your struggle was merely interference, layered emotional noise obscuring the deeper signal. And what you called awakening is nothing more mystical than recalibration, the return to coherence that allows consciousness to hear itself again. The field never withheld its intelligence from you. You were never separated from the quantum sea of possibility. Your nervous system simply learned to listen elsewhere, to voices of scarcity, to rhythms of anxiety, to narratives selling incompletion as identity. And through that tuning, entire lifetimes unfolded as battles with invisible currents that were never against you, only misunderstood. Now you see differently. Thought is no longer sovereign. It is a tool you use, not a voice that rules you. Emotion is no longer a storm to drown within. It is a tuning mechanism you steward with care. Awareness is no longer trapped inside subjectivity. It is recognized as the silent field in which all experience appears, and reality ceases to feel fixed. Opportunities that once passed unseen become luminous crossroads. Connections crystallize with uncanny timing. Movement through complexity acquires an effortless rhythm, not because obstacles vanished, but because perception now sees around them before friction even forms. This is not manifestation, this is resonance recognition. The great paradox of bending reality is that nothing was ever bent at all. Reality simply revealed the harmonics your consciousness finally learned to receive. And the power the 1% quietly use has never been secret knowledge, elite privilege, or genetic advantage. It has always been clarity of tuning. They did not gain creativity. They removed interference. They did not force outcomes. They aligned perception. They did not dominate the world. They cooperated with its deeper currents. And this power does not belong to a class, a lineage, or a hierarchy. It belongs to presence itself, accessible to every nervous system willing to slow, soften, and listen beneath the noise of story. So as you step back into your life, into its conversations, tasks, ambitions, and challenges, remember the single truth that transforms everything. You do not need to control thought. You need only remember that you are not it. You are always the signal, not the static. And reality has been waiting not for your striving, but for your listening. This is Quantum Quest, and where consciousness becomes the experiment,